Cool. Yeah, very happy to see all of you guys here today. Yeah, as we just said, we just came from an event called DeSci Berlin, which was happening at Code University on Monday and Tuesday. And so some of you may have already heard about DeSci, but it's really like a big and very quickly growing new movement in Web3. I think the term was formally coined about 6 months ago. But before we jump into the depth of it, I'm quickly going to introduce myself and then want all of you guys to introduce yourself. I'll be moderating a little bit throughout, but our goal is really to have an open and engaging conversation for you guys to understand a little bit better what is happening in the DeSci space. Cool. A few words about myself. My name is Paul Kohlhaas. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a project and company called Molecule. So at Molecule, our core goal is really to enable decentralized drug development and decentralized biotech and pharma. And in order to achieve that, we've come up with this new really building block and primitive, which is an IP NFT. But before we dive fully in, Vincent, how about you start and then we can go the run through introductions.
Yes, I'm Vincent Weiser, also with Molecule as a chief product officer and kind of started out in crypto exploring the DEX space. I did an Ethereum decentralized exchange called DEXBloom in 2017 to 2020. And then kind of also explored biotech fairly deeply and then got really involved on co-initiating VitaDaO, so kind of like longevity research DAO, also where like Molecule played a key enabling part and was one of the core initiators.
Hi, thanks Vincent. I'm Jesse Hudson. I'm an attorney at VitaDaO and a Molecule, guilty as charged. When I was in law school, I read the Ethereum white paper and thought I'd better learn smart contracts because otherwise I'll be out of a job studying contract law. And I'm glad I did because I'm here now helping to design the IP NFT system which connects legal contracts with smart contracts. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Tyler?
Hey everyone, I'm Tyler. I'm a biochemist by training, work primarily in experimental therapeutics development and aging research, biogerontology. I've spent the past 3.5 years now as a co-founder of Molecule and chief scientific officer, and was one of the co-initiators of VitaDaO and PsyDAO. And I'm really interested how decentralization and community building can help impact the way that we actually translate therapeutics to market.
Cool. So I'll give a brief maybe blast from the past of like also the reason why we're sitting here. Maybe some of you who've been in the crypto space for a while might be familiar with a concept called a bonding curve. So a bonding curve is actually a very early primitive of an automated market maker. So systems like Uniswap, actually, or Sushi, they all rely on bonding curve-like mechanisms. But so I got really interested in bonding curves. This is 2018. These were still the very, very early days of the NFT space, actually. And NFTs are, beyond art, actually incredibly interesting design primitives. They're programmable assets, so there's a lot that we can do with them. And in about mid-2018, I asked myself this, and maybe a little bit further back, I spent a lot of time in my early from my teenage years, looking at the big problems in pharma and why is drug development so expensive? And how can we create a more equitable and democratic way of how medicine is actually being developed. But yeah, so if you're interested to dig back in the past, there's an article called Token Bonding Curves in Practice, which back in 2018 asked this question, what instead of attaching a picture of a cat, because back then CryptoKitties was all the rage, punks didn't actually exist yet. Well, they did exist, but they were just coming very quietly. But the basic question, what if instead of attaching a picture of a cat to an NFT, we were to attach what is called a marker structure, which is actually the fundamental novel kind of image or molecular image that describes a new medicine or molecule. So if you patent a new cancer therapeutic, for example, what you would patent if it's an entirely new molecule is something called a marker structure. And so the basic question was, well, if we can attach pictures of cats, why can't we attach pictures of essentially chemical images of molecules? And that kind of then mattered at the time, and that took us on a long journey of trying to think through how could we actually redesign the way that intellectual property works, which is one of the fundamental value drivers in pharma. Cool. Maybe before we go too deep, Vincent, Tyler, would some of you like to talk about this new DeSci movement and also what it means for, for people?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, of course, fundamentally that, take one step back also with, for example, VitaDaO, we're a fund longevity research that we really enable to, through crypto, for people to fund research, even also together as a community. And it doesn't necessarily have to be with millions. There are also people joined us that even just provided work, for example, on VitaDaO, or helping researchers that help figure out which research to fund. I think the big power is, of course, that ultimately every one of us will have a disease at some point and will die of a disease at some point. So it's powerful, I think, to use crypto for more impactful things than just buying cat images, etc., which I also vibe with, but I think it's not the end. Culture is important, but I think it's research and science is ultimately one of the highest endeavors that should also be enabled through science. So yeah, maybe that's for me also the motivation to just also having done a DEX, having explored, I also bought CryptoKitties in 2018, but it's it didn't really catch me as much as enabling the funding of science. So I think it's fundamentally a important building block also for the future of crypto to have a broad impact on science and public goods broadly, and especially, of course, the biggest one being health and solving diseases broadly.
So Tyler, and then we'll get to you, Jesse. So so maybe a lot of you people folks have heard about DeSci. DeSci is a little bit where DeFi was in 2018. It's extremely early, but it's an extremely new, exciting space within the web, within Web3. And the reason I personally find it very exciting is because it starts breaking out of the Web3 space as this very self-referential space. Take API from one project, stake it somewhere to mint a bunch of stable coins, mint those stable coins with API in another project, get 3x leverage. And so the self-referentialism that actually pervades the Web3 space is something that we don't find as much in DeSci, because in DeSci, DeSci asked the fundamental question of how can we bridge real-world research, researchers at universities, and at research companies across the globe into Web3 to make their systems much more efficient. But Tyler, what's your definition of DeSci, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, maybe taking one step back first and just thinking a little bit about the problem space. So, I mean, there are a number of fundamental issues in access to medicine, in healthcare, in the sciences, in publishing, that are really systemic fundamental issues. And a lot of these issues basically stem from the centralization of particular players that have, in essence, a monopoly on certain spaces. This would be, for example, major publishing bodies like Nature, Cell, and Science. In the context of publishing, you could look at this from the perspective of the NIH or government agencies that basically dictate how everything gets funded, what gets funded. And so, 30, 40, 50 years ago, scientists had actually quite a bit more autonomy and agency when it came to how, what they worked on. And basically how they were able to get research funding. It didn't used to be as competitive, and there used to be, I think, more freedom to be able to just pursue an idea that you were interested in. And over the years, this is also really on the other side of that, the business models that are being created around medicines in particular or drug development have been heavily monopolized by a few large players, primarily pharmaceutical companies. And the way that they operate is basically they really, I would say, exploit, in essence, academics, people who are working in early stage drug development, who basically are at their mercy to be able to get money for research. And there's basically a ton of ideas that live in academic institutions all over the world, whether this is an early stage cancer drug, a drug for a rare disease, an antibiotic, that maybe don't have the right economics for a pharmaceutical company, maybe they're not discovered, maybe they're not interested in funding, in getting funding. And so the core thing that the DeSci community is trying to address is how to basically align incentives by taking together people who have, let's say, whether it's a rare disease, patient advocacy groups of scientists, to collaborate and work together to actually solve some of these core problems, whether it be funding, whether it be publishing. This is built on the back of a movement that's been around for decades called open science, which is basically this notion that science should be collaborative, data should be shared by everyone. We shouldn't have information that's siloed. And for the first time, decentralization is really enabling the toolkit to make a lot of those open science principles fundamentally possible. So historically, we would, let's say, want to encourage people to publish negative data, but institutionally at a high level, there's no incentive to do so. In fact, your career is often punished from that perspective if you do so. So today, the questions that we're asking are, how can we leverage many of the tools that exist in Web3 to encourage people to collaborate, to share open data, to share ownership and intellectual property, and work together to make science more or less what it was supposed to be from the beginning?
Awesome. Maybe for the audience, so there's a very famous case in pharma which relates to someone fundamentally hiking up the price of medication. So the way that IP actually works in pharma, for example, you can ask, why is certain medication so expensive? Like, why does some cancer therapeutics can cost you upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars per year just in paying for that treatment? So ultimately, the way that IP works, or patents, for example, is they give you a pricing monopoly. Actually, maybe, I don't know if it's appropriate, but Martin Shkreli has become more and more known in the NFT space, I think, and is actually also interested in DeSci. But maybe, Tyler, do you want to try and attempt to maybe explain to the audience how IP works in the case, where what Martin Shkreli became famous was with hiking up the price of specific drug by acquiring the IP?
The long and short of it is basically, so I mean, in places like the United States, there's not stringent regulation on what you can charge for a particular drug. So there's been many cases, even beyond Martin Shkreli. I mean, he became the face of it, but this is something that happens all the time, and that many pharmaceutical companies, basically, they have a pipeline of drugs. Some of those drugs are, they have a certain, let's say, growth goals, or like quarterly earnings, revenues that they need to meet. And when they don't manage to bring a new blockbuster drug to market, the way that they compensate for that is basically just by doing, in some cases, a multi-1,000% price hike on a pre-existing drug. And not because the drug has become any more expensive, not because the supply chain is limited, but Martin Shkreli did this for an HIV therapeutic, and then sort of became the face of what people consider to be like, bad pharma, or big pharma in some ways. I think, in a lot of ways, I mean, I haven't been following his reemergence in the Web3 space super closely, but I think he's just one symbol of something that is like an endemic issue particularly in places like the United States when it comes to medicines. There's not regulation on what you can charge for a drug, and people try to make up for this by just price gouging patients.
What I think is actually like the devil advocate for that is kind of like ultimately that most of drugs are off patent, so they're generics, so they don't cost anything, or they cost money, but are only basically what they cost, and a bit of like way less profit margin instead of like 99%, 10%. And what is also interesting is like a meta topic is that like most of the drug is funded by the US, like kind of like the payer or the insurers in the US pay kind of like for drugs worldwide, like India, etc. on contributing less, kind of like because they have different patent laws. So kind of like the drug pharmacy companies really try to recoup their investment mainly in the US and in Europe. So I think it's like the counterexamples, of course, that they will run out, and you will basically also have like a case where they need to make money to fund more research. I think one of the big critiques is that pharma is actually not putting so much in R&D. So basically, big pharma is like almost doing like no R&D anymore, like no fundamental research.
More like
they
banks.
outsourced it to kind of like biotechs, to academic labs, and usually acquire biotechs that are doing it much more efficiently in a smaller startup sense. So I think our role is really to like just enable more funding at the earlier stages, like even like a small biotech that is now doing the heavy lifting, because there's this valley of death basically between early academic research not reaching any progress towards like a clinical trial or towards reaching patients. So I think like that's fundamentally where we're sitting at. So I think it's like there are definitely issues with a big pharma, like I'm not trying to deny it, but I think it's like sometimes more complex than, but then it's really about like enabling more really early stage research, which pharma is neglecting.
If I can maybe make an analogy to actually NFT art today. So you could argue that if you own a certain NFT, like let's say a certain PFP of an NFT collection, and you actually own the corresponding IP rights and the copyright to this, you could decide what price other people get to use this at. So you could say, hey, I own this ape, and no one else is allowed to use that ape, reprint it, unless you pay me a certain amount. So, and that effectively means you could go out and you could, and Jesse, this is not legal advice, correct me if I'm wrong, but you could sue the people that are using your artwork without your consent. Now, the way that this works with drugs and pharmaceuticals is you can't choose if you have a certain disease. You need the medicine, but the owner of the IP gets to set the price. So if you have a certain disease and your medication costs, there's medication that costs upwards of $1 million in the United States per year. So the owner of the IP gets to decide. And so this is where then NFTs become really interesting because you're fundamentally opening up the IP and you're actually distributing ownership. So one area that we can get into throughout this panel a little bit is also something that we're really excited about is fractional ownership of IP. But, yeah?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the big take home here, like beyond like talking about why Web3 is fundamentally interesting to the space, what does it enable that has not been enabled before? And I think it's this idea that historically, when we think about IP, a piece of IP is typically owned by a single institution, right? So it's you have a company that has a piece of IP. Now with NFTs and DAOs, for example, the novelty here is that you can have an entire community for the first time actually co-owning or sharing in the ownership of a piece of intellectual property, which fundamentally changes these sort of the incentives and the ownership dynamic. So now, instead of thinking about a drug as, what is my ROI going to be when I bring this to market, you can bring together people that have a fundamentally different set of incentives. And the sort of long view of this is like, how do we treat healthcare and drug development more like a public good in that sense? Well, the way that you do it is you align the people that have the sort of most skin in the game, whether it's through their illness, through having a sick child, whatever it is, to actually be the people who are governing how these are developing. And I think what's really interesting about Web3 and what's fundamentally novel here is that there's never really been a system that was so permissionless that basically enabled people to come together in a sandbox, create a set of incentives, and then spin up a system that is sort of live and in the wild. And we're now just seeing for the very first time, I mean, VitaDaO is a great example of this. You have researchers, patients, impact investors, Ethereum OGs, NFT collectors, whatever, coming together, identifying a problem, and with very, very little gatekeeping and with significant value capture actually going and solving these challenges. And in my mind, this is entirely novel for crypto even, in terms of having a solution to maybe some of the biggest problems that are facing humanity. So while, a lot of the other NFT use cases are also really interesting and cool, and we have a lot to learn from them. But I think this is such an important moment because it's really when crypto, like you said, escapes this self-referentialism and now is interacting with universities, is interacting with patients, is interacting with researchers.
So for example, maybe just on that, so on our current kind of IP NFT marketplace, we have researchers and universities across the globe that essentially list their innovation. So this means someone might be exploring a new mRNA vaccine and is looking for $250,000 of funding to perform a set of studies and experiments. And that then actually creates an IP NFT in that system. And then we've heard, Vincent and Tyler have made numerous references to new research DAOs. VitaDaO is one of those DAOs. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with Flamingo DAO or Pleaser DAO, which are essentially these large NFT art collector DAOs. So where lots of people are pooling their capital together to collect new portfolios or to just build very strong portfolios of NFT art. Now what VitaDaO is doing, it's building a portfolio of IP NFTs in longevity research. So it's the same principle, it's building a portfolio, but now in this case of novel therapeutics. But the underlying mechanism and the underlying governance of how these organizations functions are fairly similar. But maybe before we get too deep in, I don't know if many people are fully familiar yet with what an IP NFT actually is. And so maybe Jesse, it would be awesome if you can give a formal, because IP is always like people are like, okay, IP, it's law, don't understand that, but it would be awesome if you can kind of walk us through.
Sure, and IP is a broad subject, right? You can think of CryptoPunk as an IP NFT in some ways, because if you own the punk, you own the IP related to that punk, you can sub-license it, you can create derivative work, you're the IP owner. Similarly, if you own an ape or a cool cat, because of the way that Yuga Labs has set up the IP rights associated to the NFTs, you're the IP owner. But what we're talking about is a little different from that. It attaches to the same fundamental concept of IP connected to an NFT, but it changes it a little bit. And before I get into how, it's worth understanding what is IP in general from a high-level perspective. And so IP is one of the two kinds of property. You have physical property, like your house or your building, and which is called tangible property, and then intangible property. Digital property like NFTs and cryptocurrencies are an example of that. Another example of intangible property in the same umbrella is intellectual property. And so there's a natural kind of understanding of what IP is in the crypto space. Pretty much in the NFT space, people, they get it right away. I own the IP rights to this NFT art because of the way IP attaches to these objects. And what's interesting is that IP can attach to an object even if you don't own it. A good example is the Seth Green case, who had his ape stolen recently, and he's been trying to get it back. Saying, hey, give me my ape back because I'm making a TV show based upon this ape with the image. And what he doesn't understand is that even though somebody stole his ape, they didn't steal his IP rights. He still owns the rights to that, even though he doesn't hold the physical object or the digital object that is the ape. So what we've done is we've taken that concept of IP connected to NFTs and applied it to this research space. So we said, well, what about the IP that you have the right to when you fund somebody's research into a new drug? The first example of this is the research that Morten Scheibe-Knudsen is doing at the University of Copenhagen into longevity from prescription medicines. So what he did is he looked at the whole Danish health population's data set. The data set of all prescription medicines all Danish people have taken over many, many years. And he found that certain prescription medications actually corresponded to people living longer. And there was a certain subset of those, maybe 10, and of those, maybe 4 that were really interesting, that we could look at, and if we do enough research, we may find that we could tweak those in a certain way that we create a patentable molecule that comes out of it. It's not there yet, right? But there's a research agreement saying we're funding you to do this research, and at some point, if you find a patentable molecule, then we're going to own it. We're going to own the patent. You're going to assign it to us. But right now, what do we own? We own rights to the potential IP. But that's still IP. That's still an IP right. And so what we've done is taken that sponsored research agreement, this classical legal agreement that's usually filed away in a dusty shelf, and we've attached it to an NFT that certifies the ownership of it and allows you to have a digital object, a piece of intangible property that is pluggable or composable in Web3. And it's not a great leap, right? It's not a huge leap. It's actually kind of a simple innovation. But I think often those simple innovations belie some of the most profound steps that we can take, where it's no longer just an Ouroboros snake eating its own tail, but the snake is starting to eat other stuff. And so the snake that we built, the Ipnft, is now kind of eating these research projects and the contracts related to those, so that the future IP that may be generated from them is still attached to this same certifier digital object, this NFT, this piece of intangible property that can be traded and fractionalized and distributed, and nevertheless still holds the associated IP rights, whether they're rights to future IP or an actual patent.
And maybe to add something, what's interesting here as well is, so essentially the way that an Ipnft works, someone purchases it. With the purchase, you're starting to fund a research project. So like you could purchase an Ipnft from a university that is conducting, let's say, Charité in Berlin. They're conducting maybe specific cancer research. You're interested, or your organization is interested to fund that. By purchasing the Ipnft, you transfer those funds to the university. The university now starts doing the research. But the other thing that also happens, all of the data that they produce during their studies, which is like different data sets, maybe they test this new compound on mice, looking at how that affects tumor growth within those mice. And that data is really valuable. So actually, if you think about why are biotech companies or pharma companies, why are they worth something? Well, they have IP and they have data. And the other thing that the Ipnft actually encapsulates is that data. So all of the active research data now anyone can also look at it. So you could now grant people access to the Ipnft, almost like you're granting people access to like a private GitHub repo. And now they can go through and they can look at the data. And what's really interesting now, these transactions normally in biotech would take 3 to 6 months. Sign NDAs, your lawyers meet, there's long email chains until the data is finally exchanged so someone can look at it. IP NFTs can be transferred in the same way as you transfer an NFT from one phone to another phone. So you can now, within 2 minutes, you could sell the full legal rights and all of the data associated with a research project. And what that really does now, it starts creating a much more transparent and liquid market around how research is funded and then who can own it.
Maybe just adding one point to something that you said, Jesse, like going off the first sort of use case with Morten Schabei-Knudsen. So like, why is this interesting? So okay, like there's this IP NFT now, it represents the research data, that's cool, but it's actually, I think, it's really the downstream of what that enables that is really profound. So with VitaDaO funding this, what you now have is this entire community of 5,000 token holders that are personally invested in the success of this project and that care about this project. And you have an academic community that's advising on the project and giving feedback. And this is actually quite different from how science happens in a lot of ways. This is like more like the idealized version of science that people wish for. In many cases, an academic laboratory is not sharing its data, it's not collaborating, it's afraid to show things, it's afraid of getting scooped. But what happened with Morten's project, and I think it's maybe one of the most remarkable parts of this whole thing to sort of show why this is valuable, is that there were a series of initial experiments. He had some ideas, some of them worked, some of them didn't work, and when he presented his data to members of the community and the longevity working group, which consists of other token holders in VitaDaO, there was another scientist that basically said, I think you should actually go back, change this, use this concentration of the drug instead, and he went and performed those experiments and then had a positive result, which is basically this really, really beautiful thing now where you have like this DAO, this community of 5,000 people, owns the rights to this research project, cares enough to actually be personally invested in it, in the data, in following up with what's going on, and then actually gives the researcher advice about how they could run their experiment. They go do this, and you get a positive result from the experiment. It's really, like, that's sort of the power of all this. It's the communities and the incentives that it enables in like a fundamental way.
Tyler, you used to work in Morten's lab as a postdoc, right? What's that? You used to work in Morten's lab as a postdoc, is that right?
As a postbac, yeah, years ago at NIH, yeah.
And I think what's actually interesting, like ultimately, it's not so dissimilar for me as like NFTs to traditional art. That like the fundamental argument I make also to people like on NFTs is ultimately like I had a people, but like I couldn't sell the physical. Like it was impossible to get away with. But the digital like had bids on it, was like really easy to sell. It's like ultimately you have like someone in Tokyo could make a bid on an NFT. Like it's just like very different kind of liquidity if you have a digital artwork versus a physical artwork. Like you have like global bids on OpenSea, you have like all of these primitives, like I could sell an NFT to NFTX even without having a bid on it. And there's like all these primitives enabling it, which I think is like the same for IP NFTs. It's kind of like everyone in the world could make a bid on any IP NFT, could basically through a DAO make a bid on specific projects, which I think is fundamentally the big kind of step. And then of course, like in the same sense that you build all of these NFT financializations, like NFTX, like liquidity pools for NFTs, like ways to borrow against NFTs, you can use the same for IP NFTs. So kind of like you could plug into exactly the same tool stack potentially with collector DAOs and all of these primitives that NFTs are already plugging into.
And maybe a last point to that, Vincent, as well. So we've shelled out two components actually of the IP NFT. One is the actual legal IP, which is what really drives fundamental value in the sciences. I mean, even if you think about companies like Tesla, what do they have? They spend hundreds of billions to develop core IP that then becomes more and more valuable over time as they develop products with that IP. So we have IP and that's legal, and then we have data, and the beautiful thing about IP NFTs is really that IP has been is stuck in the 20th century. It's like IP hasn't changed much since the 1960s and 70s. IP is still really literally like papers of boxes that you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to file with legal agencies. But data has increasingly become digital, so the potential of actually moving IP into the digital space and making it transactable has, I think, will have a fundamental impact of how we do research as a society. But okay, so it's legal components, it's data, but then also what we started doing is actually artwork around the disease. And maybe Vincent, do you want to speak a little bit just about some of the work that we did with Danny in terms of actually visualizing what the IP is?
Yeah, so I think maybe the interesting thing there is like you can also check it out actually on OpenSea if you type in like VitaDAO.eth, so we have DNS, you see our NFT collection and can make a bid on it. No, and it's basically like Danny from Ultra Rare kind of like or is it Ultra Rare?
Yeah, it's ultra rare.
Yeah. Basically how, like, as a scientific illustrator, really helped to also actually bring, I think, the mechanistic or like the research, like to visualize it in an interactive way. And I think the interesting thing is, of course, that like, which I think is like we've seen with projects like Loot that actually have like metadata and use them, is like most NFTs are literally just a JPEG, and we basically also have the metadata attached to the NFT, which is the therapeutic area, kind of information on the research that you all have on chain, basically in the metadata properties of the NFT. So it's not just like a visualizing really basically the type of research, but it also has like all of these attached metadata to it of the type of research. And you could imagine as projects like LabDAO, for example, that wants to build NFTs that could plug onto those Ipnfts, use the metadata, and actually basically build like full compositories of like different Ipnfts almost as a collection for a bigger project with different data repositories and like much more data attached to it also for the people owning it that can like really access the whole data that the research generated. So I think it's like beyond like a really interesting JPEG, it's also like very much more like complex and interesting metadata on the research itself, and a huge like data repository that you could basically access the data that came out through the research that oftentimes was lost in the old world. Like if you have like a big pharma company, have like a patent that's 30 years old, like good luck finding like all the research data that came out of those experiments. Like I'm not sure that they would be able to like basically resurrect like all the data that came out of the research. And I think that's also for the long-term future, really what needs to happen is that you basically have much more than just the patent at the end of the day, but also like actually all the failed research. Like you could have like a failed Ipnft, which you don't have right now. Like if a patent fail, like if you don't make a breakthrough with research, there is never a patent. And if an Ipnft fails in that sense, you could completely like open source the whole data repository and use that to actually approach it slightly differently and potentially have success. So there could even be a case for like buying failed Ipnfts, like failed research projects, look at the data and turn it into like new experiments.
Because what you're buying from a legal perspective is the authenticator token for the data repository. And the judge in Hermes versus Mark Rothschild, kind of a big NFT case out right now from somebody who made Meta Birkin bag. So he took the Hermes Birkin and he made metaverse version of the Birkin and was selling those. And Hermes sued him and said, you can't do that. The Birkin, it's our IP. And so far they're winning the case. The judge just dismissed Mark's motion to dismiss. And what they said that was interesting is that the NFT here, and the way that they refer to it in the court document, is it's just an authenticator token, the ownership of the thing. And so to look at the NFT as just an authenticator token of a large data repository that contains art and data, I think it changes science, doesn't it, Tyler?
Totally. I mean, I think thinking about this as like a variation of NFTs, like while it's accurate, I think that the forward-looking picture is thinking about this entire package as the future of how we interact in intellectual property sort of period, right? So what's fundamentally different and sort of what you were touching on, Paul, typically you have data in one place, IP in another, storytelling about what that is somewhere entirely separate. And the goal here, and I think it's something that will transcend science and research, it's really just thinking about how does data and intellectual property move into the digital age fully. Like what we have is in one composable unit, the visual storytelling around a particular research project, the data that supports that, and the legal ownership as one thing that I can move from person to person to person. And this is incredibly powerful because there's normally such a, like Vincent was saying, like you were mentioning, you go to a patent office, you look up a patent, you find some pretty abstract information about it. You then probably need to speak to somebody else or read a story to understand what the actual impact of that invention is. And then the data you mostly don't have access to, period. So I think there's, I mean, just branching out even beyond this and what might be relevant to other builders here who are thinking about intellectual property is how you can actually create these same sort of composable systems in other domains that even go well beyond the sciences.
I mean, I think one really interesting area of that would be like artificial intelligence. Like, who owns, the owner of an artificial intelligence algorithm has such power. And so an interesting thing would be you could take AI algorithms, like the IP that describes that, because it is IP. And it's like the core thing of what companies like Google are actually building out, are these IP ownership over core things like AI algorithms. You could take an AI algorithm and package that IP into an Ipnft that is now collectively owned, for example, by a consortium of researchers. Researchers could come together and say, hey, we have a couple of really interesting AI algorithms here. They're too powerful for us to own, but we all want to work on them together. We want to open up the IP. So they could be like, cool, let's take those algos and put them into an Ipnft that we now collectively share. You could then distribute ownership in the Ipnft. So this takes it one step further. We can say, and here's where it's really interesting for medicine as well. You could have, for example, a new diabetes drug. And you could say, we're now distributing ownership of that diabetes drug to diabetics that actually now co-own the Ipnft together. So you can take the Ipnft, put it into a vault, and distribute governance over the Ipnft via an ERC20 token. You could then also now make the Ipnft publicly tradable. And this also then gets really interesting in the context of open science. If you think that you've kind of made, you now create a liquid representation of a new diabetic drug, and now you run through clinical studies, people are trying this drug out for the first time, or this medicine, and now positive data emerges about the drug, it's working, that would increase the price. So, and if negative data emerges, that would likely decrease the price or decrease the funding because the drug isn't working. And so what this creates now is a much more open system for discovering new innovation, discovering medicine. The same principle could be applied for climate change technology, for example, which is also like funding public goods and making IP more of a public good rather than a monopoly that's owned by single companies.
I think we have 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Is it possible to open it up to, can we do like questions with the audience and stuff? Is there someone that's running around with a mic, or you could just shout?
I think maybe like a tiny one also, just to add to that, is that I think it's like the interesting example actually that the biggest value for like the Googles and OpenAIs is actually the data set. So kind of like same for like research is kind of like if you have like a huge like patient population data set like Morton has, like that's huge value that like people might be interested to access for tens or hundreds of thousands, isolated from the patent. So kind of like, and which I think is also an interesting thing that you could almost have like, for example, like diabetics build like a Ipnft collectively sharing their data and then ownership in that basically big data set that they then collectively own, that it's like in aligned with them as a patient. But yeah, let's go to questions.
You don't get to answer the questions.
So is all of the data stored on chain?
So essentially, the Ipnft itself is like an access key to the data, but the data itself is, so the metadata is stored on Arweave, and and then there's a private data repository that runs on top of Filecoin. So essentially, and then let's say the research team or whoever's working on it, who has like let's say write access, so they have write access to store data in the data repository that is controlled by the owner of the Ipnft. But the owner of the Ipnft could give read access or write access to other accounts that they're interested in giving it to.
Interesting.
Thanks for this amazing conversation. My question is sort of around the world of regulation. You know, already DeFi and the financial sector is going through some consolidation, but in DeSci even more because, you know, it is highly regulated. And we know that technologies like mRNA existed, but it was regulatory sort of blockages and lobbying that didn't allow it to sort of get to the place it is until the pandemic hit. So where does sort of this DeSci revolution see a role in engaging with regulation, which is sort of a matter of life and death, for the lack of a better analogy here?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I think, So what we're currently doing at Molecule, at least, is that we're targeting very early stage areas of research. So typically, let's say regulation kicks in once you have clinical trials, where now, for example, a new drug or a compound is actually being tested in patients. The DeSci space is still fairly small, and for example, to run a clinical trial, the costs, like even a first stage clinical trial, the cost will be upwards of 1 or 10, or in some cases 20 million. And so that's still a lot of money, but to fund an early stage study at a university, or let's say a study with mice or fruit flies, that will cost you $250,000, $500,000 to generate that data. And that area is generally not regulated in terms of product development. And then if you get into spaces like synthetic biology or engineering, you don't actually have much regulation there of the sciences. Tyler, and then you, Jesse.
Maybe just one thing to add to that. I mean, so there are certainly many areas where we will be encountering regulatory for sure down the road. And I think one of the most, if you look at the two most powerful regulatory arbitrage forces that exist, I would say it's capital and human capital, right? So I would say the two most powerful forces that operate in healthcare are pharmaceutical companies because they have a lot of money, and patient advocacy groups because they have, let's say, strong ethics, strong ideology, and they're listened to. What's interesting about DeSci is with like DAOs, you can really leverage both of those things simultaneously. You can have very, very large groups of actors. VitaDaO's 5,000 people, which is on the larger side for like longevity organizations, period. It is already a force globally that probably has significant lobbying power, and I think as more liquidity comes into the DeSci ecosystem, we'll see it having a substantial amount of power from a regulatory angle as well. And I think there's absolutely a political and regulatory vector here that should be tapped into.
And I think like fundamentally what I think is one important thing, because it interacts so much with the real world, like we're like a good actor and want to be like basically we want to be like the Coinbase of DeSci, not the Binance, like in a sense like talking to regulators and like acting in the best interest of like patients and ultimately of researchers as well. But I think it's like one also needs to, like, I think crypto in general, like if it's like DeFi, NFTs, everything, like just has a role to play in helping regulators understand like how basically this could usher in also I think like long term, like same for crypto, it needs regulation, but it of course needs the right kind and like of informed regulation by someone that like deeply understands the space and acts in the best interest, versus actually being regularly captured, like the risk that crypto has, of course, if the banks regulatory capture the regulators, that like and I think that's like what we of course need to achieve is ultimately to basically be on the side of patients and researchers, and only then I think will it have also like a good regulatory framework emerge, is kind of like if it acts truly in the power of in the interest of patients and researchers.
There's, just to put a cap on that, there's an interesting concept in international law, which is that the international system is anarchic. That you have these independent actors, no one controls another, and nobody's really listening to anyone else. And I think that there's an interesting anarchic thread that is woven through the tapestry of crypto and Web3 that's important to be aware of and sometimes lean into a little bit. Because the nature of self-regulation can actually cause more innovation. And the nature of disruption is very powerful. And I think leaning into that disruptive, a little bit anarchic, and this is not legal advice, I'm not your lawyer, but leaning into that disruptive, a little bit anarchic thread can be very, very valuable over the long term. And I dare say that it's part of what has made this space grow so quickly. That it's willing to take some risks when it comes to disruption of legacy systems.
Yeah, but I think actually the key one is there's like self-regulation as well as like really also like calling out bad actors in the space, because it will like it's happening everywhere, like it's happening in pharma, it's happening in biotech, it's happening in crypto. And I think like crypto really suffers from bad actors or from like players that basically bring down the good players. And I think like ultimately it needs a strong culture of like high standards and like really adhering really to patients and researcher interest to succeed in the long term. Because like, of course, regulators have the power to make crypto broadly a success or a failure. Like, and I think it's similar for DeSci. So I think the only way is to engage with them and to act in the best interest. And yeah, to strike the right balance of self-regulation and engaging with them. Yeah.
And to self-regulate. As we've discovered at VitaDaO, you know, if you self-regulate, you make a more effective organization. Sorry, yeah. Just wanted to put a cap in it, but it took a while.
Do we have time for one last question? Is there one last question? Yeah, George?
What is the connection? What's the relationship between the IP NFTs and royalties?
And royalties?
Yeah, how do you make money out of them?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends if, as the owner, you get to set the royalty terms, right? Similarly to the minter of an NFT on... Go ahead, George.
So eventually, hopefully the drug gets monetized and this gets streamed into the NFT?
Yeah, that's the hope. And that depends upon payments in crypto, you know, in order to have automatic royalties. But we do have at VitaDaO deals in the pipeline that have even been signed that are for royalties on the sales of a particular drug. And then in that case, the NFT serves still as an authenticator of the right, to say you have the right, and how the royalty is paid may not be through crypto, because the drug sales may be in fiat, and so the royalty gets paid in fiat, but the royalty right is authenticated by the ownership of the NFT.
Cool. No, it's guys, it's really fun stuff. Come check it out. You can Google IP NFTs and you'll find a host of articles about it already. This is what I'm really excited about. This is not just being applied in biotech, but we increasingly have founders in synthetic biology that are trying to explore IP NFTs for biomanufacturing. So how can we engineer new materials? How can we move away from plastics? There's folks looking at using IP NFTs in the climate tech space.
Hair.
Yeah.
And hair.
And hair. There's a DAO called HairDAO, which is looking at methods of how we can reproduce. Replace hair.
I mean, they found that someone would rather buy a new head of hair than a Tesla.
And on that note, do we have any last questions? Are we up on time? Yeah, we're good. We're good on time. Cool, guys.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think one is also to like on molecule.io as well as like VitaDAO.com to check out, like join the Discord, introduce yourself if you want to get involved. So that's the easiest way, I think.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.